Okay, thank you. Right, I am sorry about changing my title, and I have reduced my number of texts to 2 because it was just impossible, and it's already a little bit too long. I was talking to Marlene but before this session about what it means to kind of enter something that's a little bit new to you, a medium that's a little bit new to you, and what that means and how that might bring both opportunities and challenges. So you'll have to bear with me as this is a medium which, though I'm familiar with as a reader, I'm not really familiar with as a critic. So I'm just kind of working my way through some kind of sense of impressions and what this medium can do. So I hope that it's not too fragmented as a result of that. So I wanted to start with a quotation from Elizabeth Gross when she talks about untimely events that disrupt our immersion in and provoke our conceptualization of temporal continuity. And to think of dementia as potentially one of those events. For the children of those with dementia, this is a specifically genealogical disruption. Very often, as their identities as children and their places within a generational order become unmoored in some ways. It's something often expressed metonymically through a failure of recognition, as Lucy has very eloquently explored in her work. One dominant response to this temporal uncertainty in recent memoir writing has been the desire to create what we might call familial textual archives, familial stories. And there's lots of work by people like Martina Zimmerman in this area, kind of thinking about how these stories are created. And what these stories do is they weave stories of care for a parent with dementia with biography, and also sometimes with a broader family history as well. So things like Linda Grant's Remind Me Who I Am Again, if you know it, or John Thorndike's The Last of His Mind do very similar things. What these memoirs do is actively and I think purposefully blur the distinction between autobiographical and biographical acts. And of course, this is something that other autobiographical writing does too. As Smith and Watson assert, contemporary practices increasingly blend biography and autobiography into a hybrid. And that's a term I'm going to kind of latch onto. And of course, this fits in with work in relation to illness narratives. People like Wiltshire, who argue that in memoirs about illness, what he calls pathographies, they're often as much about the self that is implicated or discovered through the history of the other as they are about that other person, the patient. And of course, this reminds us of lots of work within this area of the illness narrative and the particular issues of privacy, consent, obligation and responsibility that are kind of circling around these kinds of hybrid autobiographical acts. So this involves what Cuso would call vulnerable subjects. So forms of impairment make the subject vulnerable in a very specifically embodied sense, but also vulnerable to the authorial, notarial gaze of another person. As he argues, the closer the relationship between writer and subject, and the greater the vulnerability or dependency of the subject, the higher the ethical stakes and the more urgent the need for ethical scrutiny. So considering life narratives of dementia in this light, Amelia de Falco argues that they foreground issues of ethical responsibility and the politics of witnessing and testimony. So far, so good. So it's within this kind of set of related issues today that I want to consider 2 recent graphic novels about parents with dementia, which I'll outline in a moment. And I want to consider these as these hybrid auto/biographical acts. And you have to kind of read the slash into what I'm not actually able to show you through my voice. And I want to concentrate in particular on how the reader might be positioned or relate to those acts, and how the reader is positioned in that autobiographical relationship, and what that might mean for thinking about the ethics of representation. In his phenomenological study of autobiographical reading, Schmidt argues that reading an autobiography as it is supposed to be read, as an encounter, requires an effort, notably destined to fill the gap between ourselves and the others. Schmidt asserts that to read an autobiography as it's meant to be read means to try to read without losing sight of the subject. And he uses this phrase, that you don't lose sight of the subject, which I find quite resonant in various ways. And he claims that autobiographers then write in ways that aim to ensure that the reader will agree not to lose sight of them. But that will only work if the reader keeps up the referential effort. So it's a sort of two-way process here. And this has implications for thinking about these hybrid forms of writing, of autobiographical writing. Schmidt acknowledges that his phenomenology of reading an autobiography can accommodate more than one author, but he doesn't really go on to explore what that might mean for these more hybrid forms. But employing Schmidt's terms, at least for the purposes of this paper, allows me to think about how the comic form in particular may enable, even if fairly fleetingly, the kind of readerly encounter he describes in hybrid autobiographical acts, where the reader is able to keep in sight both autobiographer and biographical subject. So I am concentrating here on what the comic form may do, not to suggest, I think, that it's only these texts in which you might have this kind of readerly encounter, but that they're kind of a good way of thinking about it because of their combination of the visual and the textual. So in thinking about what a comic may be, Hilary Shute, following Scott McCloud's very influential Understanding Comics, argues that time as space is key to a comic. So the way that time is shaped spatially on a page of comics through panel size, panel shape, panel placement, and the concomitant pace and rhythm the page gestures are establishing is essential to understanding how comics work. In comics, we see a temporal structure on the page as a whole when we look at it, even if we then read it sequentially. So it kind of complicates our understanding of space and time. Comic form also means, and this is often related to the gutters, which we get in many comics, that the reader is required to fill in the gaps and to some extent control a pace when reading, that there's some sense of kind of co-creation there, which I think really lends itself to that kind of autobiographical contract that I'm kind of talking about. So active readerly engagement, then, we could argue, is being encouraged by the polyvocal form of the comic, with its combination of image and text and also its different voices. Cohn argues that visual language, which includes that of comics, though he doesn't limit it to that, is a language like verbal written language and sign language because it has its own grammar, meaning and modality. So it's important for us to sort of recognize that. So the combination of this visual language with text in a comic offers the possibilities for kinds of representation that arguably are not available in the same way in a purely visual medium. So I'm going to turn now to the two texts and just look at some brief examples of how this might work and what this might mean for our kind of readerly experience. So the two texts that I'm going to look at today are Ros Chast's Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant and Sarah Leavitt's Tangles. Tangles is the story of Midge Leavitt's mother and her early onset experience of early onset Alzheimer's disease, which was diagnosed when she was 52. It's interwoven there with childhood memories and with what Leavitt recreates as the mother's story, or the familial story. It's very much a kind of gendered matrilineal line as well. Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant is not a memoir solely devoted to narrating dementia. It's a much broader account, and it's an autobiographical account of the last years of the lives of Chast's mother and father, during which both of them experienced forms of age-related dementia, and Chast took on the emotional and practical, psychological, and to some extent economic burden, because that is how she sees it, of care. In both comics, aging and illness bring daughters into a confrontation with a negotiation of a gendered familial tradition they rejected earlier in life. And this is particularly acute in Leavitt. It's partly related to her Jewish identity, which is also there in chat, but it's also related to her lesbian identity and the idea of coming out, which I'm not actually going to talk about today, but it's well to note that it is very important in the appreciation of this comic that you bear that in mind. So for reasons of time, I'm just going to consider two main aspects of these texts today, and hopefully I'll get through them both. The first is to look at some examples of readerly encounters with this autobiographical and biographical subject through the form of these comics, through the dialogic and polyphonic form. And secondly, and in relation to that, I'm going to think about the concern that both texts explicitly have with the role of the child as biographer and archivist, and the ways in which the texts foreground the ethics of representation, specifically through the use of archival practices. And I argue here, I think that what I see as a productive readerly discomfort is generated at moments in the text through these archival practices, which reminds the reader of the relationship between child, author and parent, and also the danger of losing sight of the biographical subject, the parent, through the autobiographical act. So both comics are quite detailed, explicit, and intimate stories of care. I'm sure many of you have read them and already know this. Chast and Leavitt often offer very self-critical reflections on their inability to live up to their ideal, often gendered vision of what a carer should be, and we see this in the Chast representation of a good and bad carer. Again, that kind of ability for the visual form to give you that representation. And just to give you some examples of how this works, the combination of verbal, of text and visual allows for representations of the intimacy of care. This is the point at which Leavitt discovers her mother, experiences her mother's incontinence. She finds her mother in a bath, and there is excrement in the bath. And it describes what happens. The choice for the carer is described, fall apart or take a deep breath and just do what needs to be done, which is kind of across the top. Beneath this are 6 compact panels that represent what does need to be done. Draining the tub, spraying the water, washing Midge, and then taking her out of the bath. Leavitt isn't really represented in those panels. You can see kind of the edge of her here. This is a kind of practical care in which the carer absents herself as daughter in order to cope with the care of her mother. Unemotive captions accompany these really simple images. And in just the way that De Falco asserts, these images challenge the myth of the disembodied and universal subject. They offer the presence and value of the imperfect, vulnerable, diseased and dying, economically unproductive body, the body in need of care, and by implication dismantle the powerfully seductive neoliberal fantasy of the liberated, independent individual. Nevertheless, I think the framing of these images of Midge within Leavitt's story, her development as a carer, and that becomes particularly acute in this final panel, where she stands in the hallway outside her door, feels a new loneliness and a new strength. That kind of sense of the narrative of the daughter being kind of wrapped around these images of the mother is I think, generating some tension between these kind of autobiographical and biographical accounts. And it reminds us perhaps uncomfortably of the hierarchy in these two stories, that the autobiographical story depends upon the material of the biographical story for its existence. Zimmerman argues that we can, in fact, and she's talking about the comic as a whole, not just those images, read Leavitt's pictures of Midge's story of her illness. We can also read it as Leavitt's confrontation with, as well as her interpretation of, that story. In its two-dimensionality, a graphic memoir offers both direct confrontation and personal perspective, and I think we can see those things kind of in quite a lot of tension here in the comic. But I think there are moments in both comics where readerly compassion and attention are more obviously redirected from child to parent. And in particular, I think this is by exploiting that pacing of the comics, that possibility of temporal manipulation. As Squeer and Marx argue, the images may expand, explode, or even contradict a narrative, enrich characterization, and control the pacing, mood, and import of a series of events. So just to give you a couple of examples, Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant? If you haven't read it, it's structurally extremely varied, and I won't kind of describe it, but the pages are all very different in their design. Some have sequential panels, some have single images. Text is wrapped around, some pages are mainly text. And that, I think, allows for the possibility, that kind of polyphony allows for the possibility of access to some kind of subjective experience of, particularly, in this example, Chast's father. So here we have George, and his concern about, well, lots of things, but particularly the bank books, which is a big kind of thing in his narrative. His anxieties are centred around the bank books at this point. The sickly yellow background and the many kind of dialogue balloons, and the sheer anxiousness of George in this image, I think are arresting. Arguably, they put George in the position of staree. He is the object at which we're staring, just as the author is. Nevertheless, and this is a danger that some critics note in Leavitt's depictions of Midge too, the frequency of images like this, and the ways in which they punctuate Chast's own narrative, makes them function also, I think, as reminders of George, so that we don't lose sight of him. And further than that, there are images of Chast herself, her avatar, which echo that. They're very, very similar. So there's a kind of visual connection being drawn between the two narratives, the autobiographical and the biographical, suggesting a kind of shared vulnerability in this caring situation. Another example of George and that kind of the way in which the images arrest the reader and kind of force the redirection, I think, of readerly attention and care. This is when his wife comes out of hospital and George, they're very close, and George is so pleased to see her. And this is a full page image of his reaction. On the other side of this double spread, we get Chast's reaction, which is feeling excluded by all of this, by the maternal, by the parental bond. But it's completely overwhelmed by this, by George and his feelings. And I think images like this do bear out Schutt's point about the possibility of this sort of temporal freedom in comics, that it might be an ethical difference in our readerly practices. It may just help us to keep in sight the biographical subject. So Tangles offers some similar moments, and sorry, I'll do this really quickly, otherwise I'm going to run out of time. Okay, so there are these one-page vignettes in Tangles. It's a little bit more regular in its arrangement of spaces, but there are these one-page vignettes, and they're made up of all sorts of things. But what they often do is attempt to suggest Midge's experience, Midge's feelings about things. So this one has Midge, and that's her husband Rob, and her feeling of kind of separation from him, very clearly indicated by the fact that he's in black, and also her feeling of, I think, isolation and fear, very clearly graphically represented by the very small image that just sits in the corner of the page here. So I just want to really very briefly look at, in the last 2 or 3 minutes, at archival practices in these texts, because I think they're really important in reminding us that we must not lose sight, in reminding us of that blending of that hybridity of stories. In Tangles, we get Tangles is made up of things that traces, she calls them, Leavitt, that she's collected over 6 years and that she retrospectively puts together to make the story of her mother. And she includes within that bits of her mother's writing. And that's very affective and immediate in the way that Schutt suggests handwriting works in comics. She is talking about authorial handwriting here, but I think we can kind of transfer that over. But at the same time, that sense of Midge's vulnerability here, and possibly our own uncomfortable, even complicit feelings of voyeurism, are very strong. We can see the breakdown of her ability to write. This is a woman whose life was spent in education. We know that she loves language. So there's a real pathos to these moments in the text, and there's a number of them where she incorporates these things. So I think we become aware then of that power of the kind of autobiographer in this text. I think more so in Chast, can't we talk about something more pleasant? When she clears out her parents' apartment, when they move into residential care, she photographs everything. And then she reproduces it within the book like this. And these are photographs of her parents' life, of her parents' home world, her parents, the thing that gave them their sense of who they were. There are 10 pages of these, and Chast's annotations, which I don't know how well you can read them, but some of them really encourage the reader to read these as evidence of the fact that her parents can't cope, as a kind of justification for why she had to make the decision to move them into residential care. There's one of loads of pencils, and the annotation reads, so many pencils, with lots of exclamation marks. So she uses them in that way. But we can also see here how she manipulates them. So she obviously she chooses what to frame, she chooses how to reproduce them. But more than that, she actually arranges the stuff within the images to take them in particular ways. So she arranges her mother's purses, her mother's bags on the bed, and then takes the photo in that way. So we're very aware there of how this is a kind of, this is a biographical act. This is an archival act. She's cataloguing her parents' lives in very particular ways, just as she is in the text. So I think that's a kind of metaphor for what the text itself is doing. More effectively, the photographs position the reader-viewer as voyeur, given privileged access to these intimate settings and the objects of the lives of these people. And the fact that Chast's parents are clearly, both physically and cognitively, very frail by this point, imbues these objects with more significance. The photographic evidence of untidy workstations, hoarding of out-of-date appliances, keeping of pencils, cements a relationship between self and thing that is made more acute by the threats to that relationship, the threat of loss of memory, of physical frailty, of relocation. All of those things that then would disrupt that relationship. And that echoes Questenberry and Squeer's suggestion that in a graphic memoir, where a body is placed within a world of objects, these, quote, would be particularly significant to a body that is odd or anomalous, and for which the objects function as obstacles or affordances. I'm going to stop now. I just wanted to show you the final image I want to show you is what Chast does at the end of the book. And I'm just going to leave you with this image as a way of kind of concluding, because I don't want to eat into Lucy's time. Because, as I said, this is kind of a way of thinking through what these images do and how they make us respond. At the end of the memoir, Chast reproduces a number of pencil sketches she did of her mother as she was dying, and then the last one is posthumous. Now, leavitt does something similar, but leavitts are embedded within sequences, and they're very simple, and there's only a few of them. There's only 2 or 3. Chast devotes those final pages simply to these, many of those final pages, simply to these sketches. And she has them on their own, on pages. They're mainly dated. They seem to be sequential. And I think the effect of these is much more intense, much more arresting than those produced by Leavitt. And it really does, I think, act as a kind of nexus for all of these ethical, representational, and narrative issues that the text as a whole explore. I hope that you don't find the image itself too disturbing, because I actually find that even reproducing it in a talk like this is a kind of ethically problematic act. So, yes, thank you. I'll pass over to Lucy.